Hello, friends. Welcome to the story I'm telling myself. It is Thursday, and you were one day closer to the weekend. And I hope that feels pretty good to you. It's feeling pretty good to me. Although, before the show started, Kelly and I were talking about how time is just water running through our fingers these days. So, you might be feeling that too. Thank you for coming to the story I'm telling myself today and joining me and my guest and your guest, Kelly Blackman. If you are here, I want you to come into the comments and say hello, make Kelly feel welcome. Let him know that you are here to learn and support. I have been looking forward to this conversation since the day I reached out to Kelly on LinkedIn and said, "Hey." So this one is going to be super sweet. But Kelly, I need to let you tell everybody a little bit about who you are. So go ahead, introduce yourself.
So I'm Kelly Blackman. I'm the founder of BE Consulting. And since 2019, we've been doing pretty much culture management. We typically are looking at doing anything, any of the work that means that you're transforming your organization. So whether that's talent development, learning and development, leadership, mentoring, that sort of thing, or if it has to do with DEI, which is what we're talking about today, those are kind of the umbrellas that our work is done in. And honestly, I'm so happy to be here with you today, Reed. I was so glad when you reached out and asked about this. It just felt like the right time.
I think so too. And Kelly, first place to contact him, great place to contact him is on LinkedIn. So I've dropped his LinkedIn link in here for you, Culture EQ, if you want to look it up directly, or you
Mhm.
can look up his name and you will find him. And for all of my HR friends, if you're going to San Diego this year for the national conference, Kelly is speaking and showcasing his book. You could get a signed copy of the book and
Mhm.
you could see his session. So make sure as you are making plans that you drop that into, and I'm certain it'll just be a continuation of all the great thought leadership that you are going to receive today.
Uh,
So you have to have been living under a rock, I think, anywhere in the world to not know that DEI is under fire from the highest levels of our nation in the United States of America. And what most of us have observed in that conversation is a whole lot of hand wringing, right? A whole lot of woe is me. And the reason you caught my attention was that you had a counter narrative to this. And so you're here to tell us about the story you chose to tell yourself in the
mm.
midst of all of the hullabaloo when basically the president said we're disbanding DI in America. So go ahead. Tell us a little bit, Kelly, about what was your initial internal
Yeah,
narrative, and then
yeah.
how did you evolve that narrative?
So I will say this. I started off in a slightly different place than a lot of people did. Back in 2020, once George Floyd gets killed, there's from my estimation, there was this big gaping hole of like leadership, of anyone willing to say, hey, you all, let's call out this and that, and all of the different kind of high emotion reactivity stuff we were seeing. So in 2019 I started BE Consulting, and initially it was really just going to be about work culture, workplace culture, to really help feed companies what they needed to be more productive and that sort of thing. Once 2020 happened, though, it's like you got the George Floyd murder, you got COVID, and it was such a high volatility time, that when I started going into meetings with companies and going into places where we're talking about things like identity and people's like resilience and work, all I saw was like tears and anger and high emotion, which is great for getting stuff started, but really, really horrible for keeping things going. So at that point, I initially was really like, oh, this is going to be a problem because this isn't going to be sustainable. And what we started to, so for me, um, doing a lot of emotional intelligence work, what I recognized right off the bat was that this is going to be something that it's there's only so long you can tell people, hey, you're a bad person because this thing or that thing has happened. And the more I learned about DEI and the more I learned about sort of the way that it shows up and the volatility of it and really how reactionary it is, it made sense that it wasn't going to be a thing that lasts. And honestly, if you look at the history of DEI, I mean, everything since like maybe Reconstruction after slavery, you see this sort of pendulum swing going back and forth. Of there's a buildup, there's a breaking point, there's this outpouring, and then there's this sort of run back to the other side. So I'm fortunate in the sense that I got a chance to see that early, and I really started building out my frameworks to be less about the reactivity, less about the moral implications of DEI, and really more about like, okay, we want this stuff to work, we want this stuff to last and be sustainable. So that was like how I entered the sphere of DEI. So I guess I felt a
Can
little
I
bit.
can I can I pause you for a
Yep.
moment
Yep.
there? And just I want to walk back into that moment with you and share a story. But I've
Yeah.
um thebeconsulting.com. If you want to
Hmm.
get to Kelly's website and learn more about his work that he's doing and his services, thebeconsulting.com. And loudfreemarketing.com. Thanks for joining us. Glad you're here with us live. As you were talking about what you were experiencing and what you were seeing in the high emotion, it reminded me of an experience that I had. Another thing
Mm,
that happened in that same contextual time was the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
mm, hmm.
And the loss of her on the highest court in the nation for women, especially, was a huge call to action. And so there, I was participating in some groups that were trying to form around really advocacy about everything that Ruth stood for. And Ruth was imperfect.
Hmm.
She didn't get everything right all the time, but even her dissenting opinions were important to moving the narrative in our nation about rights and equality.
Hmm.
And she certainly laid the groundwork for a lot of the important civil rights decisions that have
Yeah.
come around gay and transgender rights, things like that.
Hmm.
So, there's a whole cross section of people, right? There's this intersectionality around her of people. And so I was in this one group. This is all virtual, these virtual meetings, these virtual chats. And so there's a community that's forming, and all of a sudden the community starts eating itself.
Yeah.
People start getting upset because people aren't saying things the right way, because they're inserting themselves into a conversation in
Yep.
a way that
Yep.
somebody doesn't
Yep.
approve of, whatever, right? And it's just the snake eating its tail kind of thing,
Yeah.
and the whole thing just ended up dissolving
Yep.
because we couldn't find commonality in that intersectionality. We could only see difference.
Yep. Yep. Is probably not going to be a big surprise to you, but that is the menu. That is what happens, and I feel like I've seen it. I've worked with over 100 organizations on everything culture related, and I've seen this happen in so many ways, so many different ways, but still with that same sort of formula of we're in a sense sort of putting the cart before the horse. Like everyone knows, well, okay, if you put your arm or leg into someone's chest or neck and you choke them and they die on national TV, probably going to be a bad look, right? So everyone gets like that in thing, but
Maybe.
everything up before that, well, yeah, for the most part, but everything pretty much up before that is kind of up for debate. And when you start to, if you don't have that foundation of like commonality or that foundation of humanity, that the way that we get to that end result of that shouldn't happen, it looks so many different ways. And if we're being really really honest, uh, in a lot of ways, companies were reactive at that point. you know, everyone wanted to get what is it, a chief diversity officer, or everyone needed to have everyone's making pledges about how much money they're going to spend on DEI because this can't happen again, and that sort of thing. But if you also take into account the fact that so many of these places are being reactive, yeah, you don't really have time to put in the foundation that it takes of, hey, like, we're all human beings first. And if you start there, then it's not so much about your political views or that sort of thing. And you're able to offer grace, which is a really big thing, to your point about how people were just kind of how a lot of these groups dissolve and really just go through inner turmoil that destroys them.
Right. So you're reading the tea leaves. You bring a lot of knowledge and expertise to this as well, and you can see that this catalyst event, um, it's not going to it doesn't have sustainability if you
Yeah.
don't put the right pillars underneath of it. Right. It just
Hmm.
becomes like, I'm thinking about, we were just in Florida at the beach on the West Coast where the hurricanes went through,
Hmm.
and driving down the road and seeing how it's just, pulled
Yep.
all the sand and everything out from under and the foundations of the homes are
Yep.
exposed, and in some cases they're toppling. It's that same idea, right?
Yep.
Like that,
Yep.
like the next wind that blows is just going to take all of that
Yep.
away. It's
Yep.
it's shifting sand.
And it's honestly a pretty interesting thing because I'm no historian, but when I started really researching what this looks like, again, it's been a very cyclical sort of thing where, and I've done a bunch of talks about this. I call it the DEI crisis cycle, where it
Mm.
basically is like a buildup of the Breonna Taylors and the Trayvon Martins, and there was a buildup of these things that get us to like a tipping point. Uh, we have this sort of reckoning when it's George Floyd and it's big enough that we can't ignore it anymore, and then it becomes this sort of visceral reaction. And then after a certain point, it's like the empathy dies down, the volatility dies down, and we just kind of regress back to the mean. And this is across identities. This is, I don't know if you remember the ADA walk, where people walked to the steps of walked up the steps of the Capitol building, and they got out of wheelchairs, put down their crutches, and they literally crawled to make the point. Hey, these spaces aren't accessible to us. There's a version of this that happens with all types of identities, and it's really great when these things happen in the sense that, yeah, we need some kind of spark, some sort of catalyst. It sucks that it has to happen usually on the backs of the people who are worse off, but it means something, and if we use it, it makes a difference. The problem is that we kind of go right back to what we were doing before
Well,
then
we
after a
make
while.
micro progress.
Mhm,
We
mhm.
make it does
You
move
know
the
what? I would say
needle.
even better. I would say in some places, in some spaces, we make great progress. The problem is that how much of that do we also lose? And that's what it made me think of when you were talking about the sand being kind of swept away. That
Yeah.
sand was there for a reason, but it gets also swept away during these times too, because we've lost probably 75% of the high-ranking DEI executives. So that being the case, like, yeah, we had like 100% increase, but then we lose 75% of them. Then where are we at now with a company's ability to handle diversity? It's so we I think it's like that one step forward, three steps backwards sort of feeling, because we're not really addressing that root cause.
Well, one of the most interesting narratives that I have heard around the backlash to DEI is that um, white men felt under fire, just to
Sure.
the point that they finally decided to sort of rise up and push back.
Yeah.
And it and any of us, at some level, we all have a breaking point. If we feel like we are um, being beaten down,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
being kicked from every side, at some point we're either going to roll up in a ball, right? Or we're going to jump up with
That's
our
right.
fists up and fight
Yeah, fight.
back.
Yep. Yep.
And I see a side of that
Oh yeah. Oh
that
yeah.
I think is accurate.
Hmm.
And I think that's a little bit of what you talk about around
Hmm.
the blinders of DEI. Those are my words,
Yeah.
not yours.
Yeah.
But talk to us a little bit about that.
So that's pretty darn accurate. Uh, uh, a lot of people they'll cite it, but they'll cite it with a lot more blame than I kind of give it. So when the cis white male becomes the group that's under fire, or the white woman who, you'll hear the being the butt of the jokes and the Karens and the being woke and that sort of thing. When that becomes the case, this is when you start to get those calls for reverse racism or reverse discrimination. And to be honest with you, yeah, it's kind of true. I mean, the idea of diversity and equity and inclusion means everyone gets to come to the table. But as soon as you start othering a group, uh, it really becomes sort of uh, it is a reversal in a sense. And I think that a lot of times what happens is that people as individuals are going to say, well, I didn't own a single slave, like, and I'm still struggling, and my family grew up on welfare, blah blah blah. So I'm not a part of this thing, but I'm also getting beat down for stuff that I had no control over. And I think the two sides not being able to see that there's way more nuance and way more commonality than that, uh, creates this sort of bigger problem. I was on LinkedIn, and one woman, she posted something about white privilege, and this guy responds. He's an older white man. He responds and he says, I'm not sure that I've ever experienced that white privilege you're talking about. My parents grew up like for generations. My father's people were roofers, and we basically were making like $10 a day to do roofing, and at a certain point, we were eating out of garbage cans because the hunger was worse than the embarrassment of eating out of the trash. He's like, that's not privilege. And let me just tell you, he brings up a great point. The woman who did the original post brought up a great point, and what the difference was. And here's the thing: she fired back on him, and more people jumped into it, and it's just kind of this huge argument. But there's a through line that, because we're getting so emotionally attached to it, we're not seeing. Um, what she's talking about is systematic or systemic privilege,
Yeah,
and what
yeah,
he's talking about is individual privilege. And he's 100% right. Like, no, he didn't have that individual privilege. He wasn't born into money, but he could also be white and walk down the street and not have to fear if, his son or his dad or any of the males of his family would be taken or beaten or lynched. So there's still a difference. And the
or
difference
even
is that,
arrested on the spot for
yeah.
being in the garbage can,
Well, yes, yeah,
right?
and the real key is that there is a possibility, and I went through this whole thing. I made a whole second post to bring up both of their conversation pieces, and to show that through line that this is literally just a conversation. If he's able to hold back, and like his initial knee jerk reaction to her saying, "Hey, this is something that all white people have," and if she's able to stop and say, hey, there's people who are experiencing this different from the way that I'm framing it, like, that's just a conversation. But neither of them were emotionally intelligent enough or self-aware enough really to recognize what they're throwing out there. To me, that's the baseline of where all of this starts. So when I think about this from the point of view of, like, yeah, there's going to be some middle-aged white men who are going to be so angry once the DEI talks start. There's also a case of saying, if you recognize what these other, like, who you are and how you show up, self-awareness, then you recognize what you resemble to these other people and how your tone comes across, which is basically becoming aware of how you come into a room. Then at that point, you have enough agency to have empathy to say, well, let me give them a little bit of grace, and vice versa. So
Well,
it's a tough
and you
thing.
you just triggered something for me because I will share that I remember when diversity first became a thing. I was actually I'm old enough that I was in corporate life when they started doing the first diversity trainings. I remember being in the room at my corporate employer, getting diversity training for 3 days with a
Hmm.
group of other middle managers. And I remember my visceral reaction
Yeah.
to being positioned as a victim. I felt like that as a woman, I was being positioned as a
Yep.
victim,
Yep.
and I wanted no part of that
Yep.
narrative at all.
Mm.
And still to this day, is everything fair? No, but life isn't fair, right? Now,
Sure. Sure.
I do have a lot of white privilege. I will say, I didn't grow up rich either, but I
Yep.
didn't grow up
Yep.
eating out of a garbage can.
Yep.
And my
Yep.
parents maintained jobs, and we didn't have drug addiction, and we didn't have a lot of other
Hmm.
socioeconomic limiters.
Yep.
We were just blue class family, right? So I have that privilege. I got to go to college. My parents
Yep.
saved up their money and they paid for me to do those things. So I own my privilege. But at the same, my visceral reaction was, don't call me a
That's
victim.
right. That's right.
Don't, and
That's
that's how
right.
I experienced it in that moment. And and so in order to be in order for somebody to be your suppressor, you have to first say, I'm being oppressed,
That's right. That's right.
right? And I was not willing to concede that point.
Yep. Now, I will say this: I know it's one of the easiest ways to talk about this is with race and specifically with Black people because of the fact that it's such a grand sort of stage that this is on, especially in the U.S. One of the things that'll be slightly different is that Black people will say, "Well, we don't have an ability to choose any other way to see ourselves because of the George Floyds of the world, because there is active." But I also push back on that because one of the things that I recognize is that as much as race is it's a construct that we came up with, uh, there's also a way of becoming aware and changing the way that we view these things so that it's not the construct or it's not the limiter or it's not by itself just a thing. So when there's enough, I want to say enough examples of what it looks like to remove yourself from, I don't know, bad situations or bad upbringing and what have you, that there's a model to follow. So you don't have to be a victim. And the difference is what I think happened in your situation is you're able to say, I refuse to be a victim. Like, so first you're recognizing and citing that there's a choice. There's a choice. And I think a lot of times the further you are down the socioeconomic line, what your reality looks like is no choices. So you
Right.
may
That's
say,
fair. Yeah.
yeah, so you may say like, oh yeah, well, why wouldn't this person do something other than becoming a drug dealer, a basketball player, or a rapper? But in a lot of ways, what happens is that what feels real to you, even if it's obvious, not, obviously not the limiting factor for someone else, you feel it. And I think to different degrees, again, as you go down that socioeconomic line and to different identity groups, they're going to see that differently. I had one friend, Filipino, and he says, well, the reason that we're told that we have to be doctors, lawyers, blah blah blah, being Asian, is because these people grew up, our parents grew up feeling disrespected and devalued, and this is the way to say, this status is how you know I'm not that person, I'm not below you. And it's something, like people will push back on that and say, well, that's still a harsh thing to have to grow up with. But the reality is that having a choice, I think, becomes the biggest piece to that, because you were able to
Mm.
actively choose, I'm not a victim. And then you can start citing all of the different ways where it's like, no, I've done this, I work for that, and I am this person. I just think that that is a really tough line to toe for a lot of people who've been systematically kind of abused. So I definitely see it, and I see both sides of it. It's a very real conversation. But in my mind, when we start talking about the idea of where DEI is right now, and even with it being in such a, I don't know, such a place of being like beat down and kicked out of a lot of workplaces. I think it'll roll back around just because of that pendulum effect. And I think one of the biggest pieces of it will be this new sort of self-determination piece, and this piece that, even though it may not be able to be identity based, it's definitely going to be talking about self-awareness and emotional intelligence and who I am, who I see me as being, and how do I use that thing to walk into a room differently.
So we said this in the title of the show, is DEI dead or better than ever? Because you have made this pivot in your mind.
Hmm.
This is in one of the fields of study that I have is positive intelligence,
Hmm.
the work of
Hmm.
Shirzad Charmaine, and
Yep.
he
Yep.
says that that every circumstance, no matter how bad it may seem, can
That's
be
right.
a gift or an opportunity, right? And
Yep.
so
Yep.
you are looking at where the gifts and the opportunities are, even though the hardship
Yeah.
that people might
Yeah.
be navigating in this moment. And the intersection of that has to do with the emotional intelligence
Hmm.
piece.
Hmm.
So frame that up for everybody just for a few
Sure.
minutes. And then let's talk about like how we have to change our internal narrative a little bit
Yep.
in order for us to override the biology of ego.
Yeah. Yes. I'll say this. The main thing, just going back to 2020, the main thing that I was seeing in all of these different rooms was a culmination of fear, guilt, shame. Like there, that was pretty much on any side of these conversations, whether it was black, white, brown, whoever was in the room. There was
And for
some version.
listeners, just know shame is one of the most destructive
Yes, yes, yes.
emotions that anyone
Yep,
can
and limiting.
experience.
Yep, yep, yep. What's interesting is when I saw that that was impacting everybody in the room. Like everyone has their own different relationship with DEI, but that was impacting everybody in the room. What I initially thought was, okay, so let's start to work out how do you talk to someone who is anti DEI, and especially over
Mm.
the last couple of years before the election when it started to become a little bit more of a visceral negative sort of feeling toward DEI, and people were feeling limited by it, and there's all of these talks about reverse racism and that sort of thing. My work kind of centered around how do you talk to someone who says no, this isn't merit based, or any of those things. There's hard data to talk about how much better workplace is when there's diversity, that sort of thing, but there's not a whole lot of emotion based data that kind of says, well, this is better because although you're not black, you maybe aren't trans or gay, you like you still have multiple identities that show up. Are you a veteran? Are you older? Are you younger? What is your education like? Are you tall? Are you shorter? Are you obese? Like there are plenty of identities that DEI not only protects but makes it okay to bring those to the table. And I had so much success talking to people who maybe weren't feeling DEI, or really had questions about uh, the efficacy of it.
Mm.
That was one piece, and honestly, talking like there's a fringe section of people who are just like, no, I don't like it, and I don't care what you're talking about or the reasoning. But there was a huge section of people I found that were just like, yeah, let's discuss it. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, there's data to back that. Oh, that I understand. Let me tell you who the biggest problem people have been. Uh, it's been the pro DEI folks, and that when you start talking about ego and fear and shame and that sort of thing, I've had so many people really just angry at me because I'm making a point that this has to go deeper than identity. So since Trump and the new administration have said, well, you have to remove identity stuff, this has gotten uh worse and easier, I guess, because I can now say, well, yeah, identity can't be the leading piece because it's automatically a divider. And as soon as you bring up identity, you've excluded anybody who's not that. Um, the reality is that there's so much, at least what I found, there's so much kind of untapped space for where people have their own biases. They have this, specifically pro DEI folks, they have this sort of sense of righteous indignation. We're the good guys, so we're fighting a good fight against all those racists and bigots and all those people who hate everyone. And it's like, well, I've talked to the other side of this. Those aren't the typical person that you're finding. So what I found in really both pieces, the conversation has to start with this idea of we have to stop vilifying people and deifying other people, because the large percentage of people are just concerned about the same thing that everyone is concerned about. I want to be okay. I want my family, my friends, the people who are in my same group to be okay. As you start to discuss that, that changes the whole complexity of everything. Because I can say to, again, cis white male, the bad guy, I can say, well, how do you want your kids to grow up? Well, I want my kids to grow up happy and in a world that understands fairness and blah, blah. Like most people aren't going, I really don't want those people to succeed. So I think when you start talking about it from that point of view, you kind of move past the ego stuff that moves us into like tribalism and that fear-based sort of thinking, and then you move it into more of a collective. And I heard someone say this recently: mankind won't be until we start seeing other humans as an extension of ourselves versus somebody else.
I
And I
love
think,
that. Yes.
yeah, because you think about ants, ants are like, yeah, this is my lane. This is what I do. I'm a part of a bigger thing. And people, we're just not quite there yet.
Well, I think that you are really naming an important connection that I've not heard named this way, but I think you are spot on, Kelly. And that is labeling activates tribalism.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Labeling does activate tribalism,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is going to put us in an us them conversation.
Hmm. And I'll tell you, I get a lot of pushback for that because people say, well, this person won't understand my life, my experience, so I have to break down the specifics, things that are specific to me. 100% true. So it's not a problem with labeling, it's a problem with labeling before figuring out that there's a collective first. So if you come from the point of view that, yes, just very, very honestly, very generally, people are people, we all have very similar needs. So if I understand that that's the case, I'll tell you a perfect example. Um, if I live in my house and you live next door, and I think about, well, Rita can't pay her rent. She's falling short on her mortgage, and that's Rita's problem because mine is okay. As soon as I think of it from that point of view, I can no longer care about your stuff. But without recognizing that if Rita can't pay her mortgage, then that means that maybe her house is now abandoned. And that also means that maybe now the property value goes down because, this place gets dilapidated, blah, blah, blah. By me recognizing that we are a unit, our neighborhood is a unit, our area is all one thing, then now is not a me versus you or me and you sort of thing. It's really an us. And we do
Right.
that with
Yes.
our children and our spouses. We do that with those connections, not realizing that those connections really do extend because we impact each other in the workplace. We impact each other in our communities. If we don't take a look at that, we don't necessarily see that first we're a community and then we're individual households. And I think just putting those backwards has been one of the real issues that we run into.
I think that I think this is absolutely brilliant, and I see the pathway forward that you are seeing, Kelly. It's
Hmm.
not that we are denying the
Yeah.
difference. It's like you said, it's the order,
Just the
right? So
order. Yeah.
first, first we've got to connect and respect one another, human to human.
Yep.
Let's figure out
Yeah.
all the values that we have in common. Let the common
Yep.
lived
Yep.
experiences, the things that say, wow, you and I have a lot in common. Like
Hmm.
we could
Hmm.
hang out together, right? And
Hmm. Hmm.
once we recognize that you're more like me than not like me, Now, when you start bringing in, but here's my lived experience that
Yep.
is
Yep.
different,
Yep. Yep.
and what is impeding my ability or my
Yep.
family's ability
Yep.
to maximize
Yep.
their position in society,
Yep.
then I have a reason to care, to help, right?
Yep.
And this
Yep.
is, this is where I think this is why, especially in churches and stuff,
Yep.
they come to mind where, it's not just the faith underpinning, but it's community
That's right.
first.
That's right.
And there's such a strong caring in that community that then you're able to transcend all these other things.
I'll tell you this too. Fun fact, and I'm actually working on a book about this. The reality is that, especially in the U.S., there's been almost a dismantling of those other systems. So the church, the community, family, they're not nearly as tight knit as before, and it really starts to expose us to sort of an atmosphere where those are the places where we learn to be a group, where we learn to be together. And guess what place is left now for us to all have to do that at? Work.
Work. Well,
So it
see,
ends.
the morning for me is, I've been in the world of work now more years than I've
Yeah,
not,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and I have corporations, especially workplaces, have been the learning ground and the proving ground for a lot of the social movement
yeah,
that we have
yeah.
seen,
Yep,
social acceptance. I mean,
yep,
in business has prided itself in some ways in leading that charge.
yep.
And to see people backpedaling so fast is very disappointing for certain. But the thing, we're
Yeah.
running out of time. And so to
Well,
summarize here, dear listeners, the
oh yeah,
thing
I'm
we
sorry.
want you to hear is DEI is not dead. However, to more effectively move that conversation inside of your communities of practice, be they work or
Mhm.
other places, start first with connecting human to
That's right.
human,
That's right.
and then begin to explore the places of difference and just see if you can, and that's going to shift, that's automatically going to shift the ego narrative
Yep.
inside of us, because we're no longer going to be fighting for that pecking order position,
That's right.
because now we've already built the groundwork where we say, oh yeah, we are more similar than not.
Yep. Yep. Agree.
Final thoughts. What do you want to share with the folks before we have to say goodbye to them, Kelly?
So probably the biggest thing will be that there are models available. I've definitely done one for for that I use. There are models available that help you to operationalize that sort of thinking of how to build that foundation first. You can always reach out to me, and I'm happy to share those with you. But if you start from that point and you're really intentional, every company I've worked with has shown an increase in all of the ROIs, the measurables that people really care about. So engagement, engagement, attrition, things like that. Uh, Job purpose, feeling like you have belonging. All of those numbers have gone up using these tools. So 100% going to recommend that. Oh, and there's my free culture kit. If you click on there, it's all free. You can download the kit, and I've especially made it to walk you right through. So if you don't have a lot of experience with engagement, this will actually help you to measure what your company is doing and to plan out a path forward.
And if you were like our dear listener Sharon Summerfield or me, and you love a good book, Kelly, what's the name of the book and where can they get it?
Oh, it is called Future Proofing HR today, and you can get it right on Amazon or yeah, right on Amazon.
Awesome. Everyone, thank you for spending your Thursday with us. If you are catching us in the replay, feel
Yep.
free to jump in and post your questions or comments. And Kelly and I will be monitoring for that, and we will be responding to you. Coming up next week on Monday, it's right around the corner. Bonnie Lowe Craman is with us at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Bonnie's an author, she's a TEDx speaker, And we're going to talk about the truth about burnout. She's going to share her own
Mm,
story about the stories we tell ourselves about why we need to prioritize work over everything else in our lives and the penalties that we pay for that. So, whether you are experiencing that or you're young enough to avoid all those pitfalls, you're going to want this episode. So, if you've got some young adults that are just entering the workforce, this is probably a good episode of cautionary tales that they're going to want to hear and learn from. And then on Wednesday, John Brooks is with us. He's an entrepreneur, business owner, and he's going to tell a story about being late to the party and how that was the most transformational moment. We have these stories of perfection, but how
yep,
we have to show up all the
yep.
time. And he turned this moment of humanness into something extraordinary for himself and his business. So you're not going to want to miss that one. Those are coming up, and he is Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Kelly,
Woohoo.
I wish we had more time.
I
We
know,
could
I know.
continue to talk about this. I am so happy to continue in conversation with you about this. I wish you every success with your book. Thank you for the gift to our listeners. Again, if you have questions, please reach
Yep,
out to
yep.
Kelly, come into the chat here in the replay, and we would be happy to continue this conversation with you. This has been a delightful way to spend my afternoon. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, listeners. And I will see you next Monday with Bonnie Locraman. Don't miss it. Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
all. Bye.